Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. We have a multi-day stretch of active severe weather that is ongoing today through tomorrow and Monday across portions of Texas into the southeast. Today we have a large slight risk covering much of central Texas, parts of west central Texas through places like Waco, Austin, San Antonio, under the gun for the greatest severe threat today in the level 2 out of 5 slight risk area. We do have an all hazards threat, but the main threat today is going to be large hail. Perhaps significant hail. We could see some hailstones in excess of 2 inches in diameter, especially within the 15% hatched hail area there within the slight risk. That is going to really focus this evening into the overnight hours into tomorrow morning as storms get going tonight as the system moves in. We also do have a low-end tornado and damaging wind threat. Tornado risk is very low. There are some limiting factors we'll talk about here in just a second, but there is a non-zero threat for a tornado or two with this activity today, extending all the way into East Texas, Louisiana, and into western Mississippi overnight. And also a damaging wind gust or two is on the table. Then we go into tomorrow, February 11th, which is Sunday, Super Bowl Sunday, and we have a slight risk from East Texas extending through Louisiana, Mississippi into western Alabama with a marginal risk surrounding that. We just got the update for the Day 2 outlook. Not much has changed. Wanted to wait to do this video until they updated the Day 2 outlook in case they were to increase the risk, but they have not done that at this point because of some limiting factors, again, which we will discuss here in just a little bit. But slight risk extending from East Texas, places like Lufkin, the North Houston metro area over toward Louisiana, Alexandria, New Orleans, into Mississippi and Alabama, Jackson, Mobile, Gulfport, under the gun for that level 2 out of 5 slight risk tomorrow, Sunday. All hazards on the table with tomorrow's activity. 5% tornado risk there within the slight risk area from East Texas into western Alabama. Also, we have a damaging wind and large hail threat with tomorrow's activity. Then the threat will continue even further into Monday, where we have a Day 3 slight risk from eastern Alabama into northern Florida, Georgia, into parts of South Carolina for the severe threat that will continue into Monday from Sunday's activity. So, wanted to go through the setup here with you all in this video. Just going to do probably this one video on the entire setup unless something more notable becomes apparent over the coming days. But this video is going to be probably the only video I will do on this setup, and we'll try to encompass all of the I'll try to give you some of the outcomes and potential drawbacks that this setup is facing as far as a more notable severe risk. But there is a pretty significant severe risk that is expected to develop today, especially tonight into the overnight hours, going into tomorrow and on Monday. So let's go ahead and get started. First, let's show you what's going on right now. I'm recording this just after 11:40 p.m. Central Standard Time. And we have had some pretty significant activity this morning. This batch of storms right here that is moving into East Texas has produced some sporadic large hail, had some severe warnings with this activity, especially in the Austin metro area this morning. That has since moved off to the east. No warnings as I'm recording this right now, but we could see some instances of large hail out of this activity as we go into the afternoon. New batch of storms firing up to the west as well. Same thing applies to those storms. Could see some isolated large hail, damaging wind gusts, and maybe a tornado or two as our main surface front slides to the south. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But overall, we could see multiple rounds of convection continue to fire through the afternoon before our main round comes in and fires across West Texas this evening into the overnight hours tonight. All right, let's dive into the meteorology behind this setup. We'll start off at 500 millibars from the SPC mesoanalysis page. And right away, you see this big old trough that is digging down into the southwest U.S. This is going to be our main synoptic forcing mechanism for this setup. It's going to continue to maintain a very positively tilted nature. You see the axis there. It looks something like that, very positively tilted trough, and it will maintain that positive tilt as it moves into the southern U.S. until probably early Monday morning is when it will start to take on a neutral to slightly negative tilt for our Monday setup. We'll talk about that here in just a bit. And we'll show some model data to give you the progression of this trough over the next couple of days. But going into tonight and tomorrow, it will continue to make its way off to the east, and it will, again, maintain that positively tilted nature as it moves into Oklahoma and Texas. But very broad, high-amplitude trough here. That will be our main synoptic forcing mechanism. Some concerns over the overall timing with this wave. It's a little bit off. We'll discuss that as we go through the model data, but still, this is going to be our main synoptic forcing mechanism in this environment. Going down to the surface, we have seen broad southwesterly flow traversing the Rockies for quite some time now associated with this trough, but really not anything that is super focused. So we haven't really seen a very tight surface low develop, maybe just a broad, very broad cyclonic flow here across western central Mexico, West Texas, New Mexico area, but nothing tight yet, nothing really tightly wound as far as a surface low goes. We will start to see that begin to occur tonight into tomorrow as we'll get surface low development out in here, and it will move off to the east, and that will modulate where our severe threat sets up. So as that trough moves across the Rockies, the main belt of flow, which is still relegated to the backside of this trough, we go back to our 500 millibars, still relegated mostly to the backside of the trough, starting to round the base of this trough. So it's undergoing its maturing phase as we speak. So as it does that, as that strong belt of flow traverses the Rockies, we will get more intense surface low development out here across the southern high plains. Similar look down at 850 millibars, not much of a low-level jet to speak of across the plains, again, because we have not really seen that trough and that strong belt of flow associated with that trough make its way across the Rockies yet and initiate that more intense low-level cyclogenesis. That is expected to change as we go into tonight and tomorrow. We will see surface low and low-level cyclone development here, so we should see some, at least modest, increase in low-level flow as we go into the day tomorrow. But it's not going to be a super intense increase because, as we've talked about before very often on the channel, this is going to be a very positively tilted trough. And as you see right there, very positively tilted, and that is going to maintain as we go into tomorrow. Now, as we've talked about before, a lot of your significant severe weather outbreaks occur with more negatively tilted troughs, and the reason is because you tend to get stronger differential temperature advection between the low levels and the mid levels and mid and upper levels, so you get stronger instability. And also with a stronger, more negatively tilted, tightly wound upper trough, you'll get a more robust low level response, so a more intense surface low and more intense low level jet. Doesn't mean you can't get severe weather with positively tilted troughs. We've seen many a severe weather outbreak occur with positively tilted troughs, but it tends to be in positively tilted trough cases that your low-level response is not quite as robust. So we're not going to see a super robust low-level cyclone develop, and therefore we will not see the real strong increase in low-level jet and low-level flow and low-level shear as a whole with this setup tomorrow. We will still have an adequate profile for severe weather and all hazards threat, especially going into tomorrow and Monday, but it's not going to be it's like a 60, 70 knot low-level jet that you might see with a really high-end severe weather outbreak in the southern plains or southeast in the early spring. Taking a look at our raw surface data here, this is our most recent set of observations. You see a pretty clear wind shift and temperature gradient across southern Oklahoma into west Texas. You see the winds out of the northeast across Oklahoma, more easterly and southerly across central and north central Texas. We also have temperatures in the 30s and 40s across Oklahoma, 50s and 60s down here to the south. So there is a pretty clear wind shift right along there, pretty clear frontal zone that is located somewhere in that vicinity there. It will continue to sag south as we go through the afternoon today, and that will be our main boundary that will really establish where the surface-based severe threat and where elevated storms will occur this evening. It's going to continue to sag south and set up somewhere here in south central to west Texas, and that any storms that interact with that this evening may have a chance to produce a brief tornado or two, but otherwise the storms may tend to cross the boundary pretty quickly. North of the boundary going to be much cooler at the surface, tendency for elevated storms there, but any storms that can remain south of this boundary going into tonight will have that surface-based severe threat of damaging wind gusts and maybe a brief tornado or two, especially those that interact with the stronger low-level shear region along the boundary itself. Pretty moist air mass situated across south central and southeast Texas. Dew points in the 60s, upper 60s, even some 70s readings down here in far south Texas. So pretty abundant moisture already in place. We haven't had any strong cold front sweep through the continual wave train, if you will, that's come through the southern U.S. We've had some marginal severe threats the last few days. Initiated by these smaller sort of short waves in the flow, and that has allowed for somewhat of a low-level response, and we've allowed this moisture to seep back inland rather than some of our previous events this spring where we've had a pretty strong cold frontal intrusion sweep all the moisture out well into the Gulf. And as a result, we don't have enough time to really get robust moisture inland. In this case, we already have pretty robust moisture sitting inland across parts of southern Texas, and that is going to bode well for a severe threat tomorrow in that we will have a pretty broad warm sector to foster severe storms for the upcoming couple days severe weather events. Here was our observed sounding at Corpus Christi, Texas this morning. Not much here as far as thermodynamics go. We do see a pretty deep low-level moist layer extending up to about 700 millibars, so very high-quality moisture within the warm sector, 69-degree dew point at the surface, and that moisture extends all the way up about 3 kilometers up into the atmosphere. This morning's storms didn't have much instability to work with, likely more on the elevated side, a little bit of a warm nose there, just above 700 millibars. So thermodynamics not really quite there yet, but again, with all that clearing moving in from the west, we should destabilize through the afternoon, and with the approach of the trough, we'll start to see those thermodynamics improve a little bit as we go into the afternoon hours today. Kinematics looking pretty good, very lengthy hodographs, effective bulk shear above 70 knots, so that's very, very strong deep layer shear, plenty of shear for organized convection, not a lot of low-level shear to work with in this environment, and that's not likely to change a whole lot throughout the day into tonight, as again, the low-level response with this incoming trough is not expected to be super robust. So we're not going to see that increase in low-level jet that we might see with a higher-end severe weather outbreak or a more negatively tilted trough. So this is going to be a very much hail-favorable wind profile. Very long hodographs, deep layer shear favorable for supercells. Very much straight hodographs, not much low-level shear to speak of. And once that instability works its way in, that will be an environment that will favor supercells with a large hail threat, especially those that cross the surface front, as we talked about. Once the storms become elevated, that will give them a tendency to produce large hail tonight, especially across central Texas. All right, let's dive into some model data here. This is the 12Z NAM, this morning's run of the NAM model. We'll start at 500 millibars, and as you can see, here is our trough across the desert southwest, that belt of strong flow, as was initialized this morning, still on the backside of the trough, but it quickly starts to move around the base of the trough, and we start to get a little bit more tightly wound trough, starts to close off a little bit going into the afternoon on Sunday, tomorrow, and very strong flow in the exit region of this trough. Very, again, positively tilted trough, so that's one of the reasons why we're not going to see a super robust low-level response with this setup. Now, one of the things you notice here is that, if you recall, our severe threat for tomorrow was situated somewhere in this vicinity here, across East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, into western Alabama. Notice that it is a little bit farther removed from the actual exit region of the trough. We're sitting here mostly just across in broad southwesterly flow. And we talked about this before in these southeast type events, that oftentimes that's a good thing. Usually less forcing is a good thing. But the main forcing with this trough is going to be a little bit displaced from the actual warm sector ahead of the surface low. And that is always a question mark for me when I'm looking at potentially storm chasing these southeast setups. I really never have seen a setup like this work as far as a widespread severe threat when your main forcing is displaced quite a bit from the overall warm sector. And that's going to lead to perhaps a little bit of issues maintaining robust storms tomorrow across the open warm sector. We'll have storms ongoing overnight from tonight's activity. They'll extend into tomorrow morning across East Texas. And as far as initial or additional development goes from East Texas into the warm sector tomorrow, it's unclear how much that will maintain itself. The fact that the overall forcing from the upper trough is displaced from the warm sector lends some questions as to how robust and how robust the supercells will be and how much they'll sustain themselves. You can see even a little bit of ridging here at 500 millibars across the southeast. So we're really going to have to rely almost solely on warm advection out here. Don't really see any short waves within the flow. We'll take a closer look here in just a second, but usually when you're talking about open warm sector convection in these southeast events, you usually have some type of forcing, some sort of short wave or something in the warm sector to help initiate those storms. Here, not really seeing a whole lot, just broad southwesterly flow, not really seeing any notable kinks in the flow. We can go down to 700 millibars and look for that, but I'm just not seeing much in the way of short waves here across the warm sector. So that lends some concern to me that we may not be able to sustain robust, long-term, long-track supercell updrafts. So that's something to keep in mind. If this trough was ejecting a little bit faster here, the forcing was somewhere across Louisiana and Mississippi, I'd be saying, yeah, we need to be paying lots of attention here to a perhaps even more significant event that is currently forecast. But right now, I'm a little bit skeptical of the overall maintenance of any long track type supercells. It may tend to be a little bit more popcorn type supercells, and they may not last all that long. Just something I've seen in previous southeast events, and something to watch for tomorrow for sure, the displacement of the overall forcing from the overall warm sector. So that trough will continue going in along the Gulf Coast going into Monday, and you see it does start to take on a little bit more of a neutral to almost slightly negatively tilted nature here by Monday afternoon. Strong defluence aloft in the exit region of this trough. If we go up to 250 millibars, you'll start to see a little bit more defluence in this trough as it moves into the southeast for Monday's threat. So Monday, definitely eyeing Monday as maybe a potential day where we might see a little bit higher severe threat than is currently forecast, a little bit more favorable configuration of the trough. And it looks like the NAM has been a little bit more robust with this setup across the southeast for Monday. So let's go down to the surface and see how our surface low is going to develop through the period. So we'll start and zoom into our southern plains sector. So you see not much going on here across the southern plains at the surface this morning. That continues through much of the day. We do start to see a little bit of an intensification of the surface cyclone by this evening. This is at 0Z tonight, so 6 p.m. Central Standard Time this evening. A little bit better surface low development that will help that warm sector remain inland and at least try to provide a little bit more robust environment for the storms this evening into tomorrow. You can clearly see that front. Clear wind shift and temperature gradient right along here. So there's our frontal zone at 0Z. The NAM has this continuing to sag southward, and the NAM does a pretty good job handling these cold air intrusions. So I tend to believe the NAM a little bit more than other models when we have these sagging front type scenarios. So the NAM definitely has the front continuing to sag into the evening hours, and that may have some implications on how the duration of the surface-based storm threat in tonight's environment. So this is at midnight tonight. Here is our frontal zone. You see the temperature gradient and wind shift here. So it'll probably look something like that. Storms are going to fire here across the Edwards Plateau of West Texas. And with the southwesterly flow aloft, they will tend to cross the boundary pretty quickly, especially if it keeps sagging to the south. So that is probably going to lead to a much more limited spatial extent for surface-based storm development. And again, storms are likely to cross the boundary pretty quickly. Now, as they cross the boundary, that hail threat is going to ramp up as they become elevated. But any surface-based storms down here to the south, or as storms interact with the sagging surface front, that is when the tornado threat is going to be greatest. Again, if storms can remain south of the boundary, any storms that can remain south of the boundary in the warm air mass, and as storms interact with the surface front. And that may be a brief time period given the southerly sagging of the front and the eastward motion of the storms. But as the storms interact with the frontal zone, that may give them a very brief window to produce a tornado or two. But again, I think that's the reason why hail is going to be the biggest threat with this evening's and overnight's storms, is because they will probably have a tendency to cross the front and become elevated pretty quickly. Now, the front does extend out here across East Texas into Louisiana and Mississippi. A little bit better orientation out here for these storms to follow the front. So perhaps a little bit better tornado threat out here with these storms. And given that it's a little bit farther from the forcing, storms out here farther to the east are going to be much more sporadic in coverage. That's why your slight risk is expected to be here across central Texas. Just a marginal risk out here. Low end all hazards threat along the boundary, a little bit more favorable orientation of the boundary with respect to storm motion. So we could see a brief tornado or two and maybe some isolated, marginally severe hail and damaging wind gusts out here in East Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi overnight tonight. And then as we go into tomorrow, that surface low will try to deepen just a little bit. You see a little bit better closed contours there. And this has been a big change going into the last several model runs. So let's take a look at our dew points first before we do that. And we'll show you what's changed here in just a second. So this is our moisture field, surface dew points as the NAM saw it this morning. Widespread 60s across Texas, the southern half of Texas into Louisiana. And as we go into the day-to-day, that's going to basically stay put. You can see that front sagging southward pretty significantly there by this evening. And it continues to sag south going into the morning tomorrow before that surface low finally kicks in and ejects off to the northeast, allowing that warm sector to build here. So this is at 21Z, 3 p.m. Central Time tomorrow. You see the westward extent of the severe threat modulated by the boundary here, and the warm front situated across East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Here, the northern extent of those 60s dew points. Now, this has changed a lot, as I just said, here across the last several model runs. So let's take a look at the last several model runs here. So this is the moisture. This is at 0Z, so 6 p.m. Central Standard Time tomorrow night, Sunday evening. So this is what it's currently showing. Warm sector looks to be right in here by 6 p.m. Central Standard Time tomorrow, bounded by those where the higher dew points are. And if we go back several runs, and we'll go back to yesterday morning's run. This is the 6Z run on the 9th, so midnight yesterday morning. You notice how much different our warm sector looks. Much better northward advance of the moisture, much broader warm sector, and so we had a much more real estate for storms to work with in these previous model runs compared to what we're seeing now. We still now with the current model runs, we still have a fairly broad warm sector here, lots of east-west real estate for storms to happen. That's why I was a little concerned initially that we may have a longer duration severe threat, was because we had such ample real estate in the warm sector for potential multiple rounds of prefrontal supercells to work with. But the fact that we're seeing that surface low a little bit less robust, or actually significantly less robust northward advance of the warm sector leads to a little bit less area for these storms to work with, and therefore the overall northward advance of the severe threat looks like it's going to remain fairly confined to the southern half of Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, going into tomorrow's threat. Now we continue on, and this is when things start to get interesting on Monday. I'm going to shift to the southeast sector here, and you'll see as that trough takes on a much more negative tilt. I'll go back to the surface data here. So you see that modest surface low moving off to the northeast along the front. And you see it starts to really wrap up as we go into Monday. Many more closed contours here, tighter surface low as the low deepens in response to the upper trough becoming much more neutrally tilted. So a much more robust low-level response going into Monday may provide for a better environment for significant severe weather going into Monday. Much broader warm sector here, much wider warm sector, much more northward advance of the moisture there into the eastern half of Alabama, much of Georgia, and eventually South Carolina. So better warm sector, better dynamics to work with on Monday. Makes me think that we may need to watch that day, Monday, for perhaps a little bit higher severe threat than what is currently forecast. But again, we'll have to just see how tomorrow plays out before we can make judgments on Monday. And I'll have updates on that, at least some posts, as some of these things become more clear. But as we go through Monday, that warm sector continues off to the east, and then by early Tuesday morning, we are done with this severe threat with this particular setup. So let's go ahead and go back. Let's take a few forecast soundings from across the region. We'll start with this evening's activity. So we'll go all the way back here. So here we are. There's our moisture. There's our frontal zone. This is at 6Z. I'm going to take a sounding here south of the surface front. So just south, see what the environment looks like just south of the surface front. Pretty decent environment here. You can see decent instability, 1600 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, so more than adequate instability. Steep lapse rates loft ushered in, a little bit drier air, steeper lapse rates out west being ushered in on that southwesterly mid-level flow. Lapse rates in the mid-levels averaging about 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer, so very steep lapse rates there for some more robust updrafts this evening. Deep layer shear, again, very favorable for supercells, long hodographs in excess of 60 knots of effective bulk shear. Again, low-level hodographs, not too much curvature in the low levels of the hodograph, not much low-level shear, not much veering and strengthening of the winds in the lowest kilometer or so of the atmosphere, which would be favorable for tornadoes. So this is, again, more of a hail hodograph with long hodographs, strong deep layer shear for supercells, adequate instability, especially around the freezing level, to support robust updrafts, and especially as those storms cross the boundary, they may have a tendency to produce significant severe hail. So this is a pretty classic-looking hail sounding. Wouldn't be surprised if we saw a brief tornado or two, especially where low-level shear is maximized along the frontal zone. We do have a little bit of curvature there in the hodograph, but overall this is a very much a straight hodograph, more favorable for large hail. So that is this evening. Let's go ahead and go into tomorrow. That warm sector starts to make its way eastward. And here we are, 21Z tomorrow, so 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. Let's take a sounding there in East Texas. Then we'll take one out in the open warm sector again. Again, I'm a little skeptical of how much convection and how the convection in the warm sector will sustain itself tomorrow, so we'll have to watch that for sure. But this is East Texas at 3 p.m. Central Time tomorrow on Sunday. Solid instability, 1500 joules per kilogram plus instability. Decent low-level instability as well, 0 to 3 kilometer CAPE, about 80 joules per kilogram. So decent chance for robust updrafts there, especially in the low levels, which may aid in tornadogenesis in any of those storms. Again, storms will probably be ongoing from tonight's activity going into Sunday morning and early afternoon, and we'll see additional development to the southwest of that in the warm sector and near the frontal zones. But overall, decent looking profile, a little bit of curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph. Again, because we don't have a super robust low level response associated with this incoming positively tilted trough, at least for Sunday's threat, we're not going to see that low level jet spike to 40, 50, 60 plus knots where we really see these large looping hodographs. But still plenty of curvature there for a tornado threat or two for any right moving supercells. about 200 meters square per second squared effective storm relative helicity amid very strong deep layer shear for supercells. So certainly looks like supercells and probably a mix of supercells and line segments are in the cards there tomorrow. And again, the overall degree of convection and how much it will sustain in the open warm sector is a little bit in question given the lack of forcing over the warm sector. We can take a look at the surface map here, see if we see any prefrontal troughs or anything, little surface confluence bands. Not really seeing a whole lot on the surface data tomorrow. So yeah, I'm just a little skeptical of how much activity we're going to see in the warm sector and how it will sustain. We're going to have to rely purely on warm advection out here across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama with a lack of any forcing mechanisms out there. You can check at 700 millibars. Not really any short waves to speak of in the warm sector, mostly just broad southwesterly flow, a little bit of ridging there again across Mississippi and Alabama. See if we see any mid-level fronts there, 850 millibars. Not really seeing a ton of convergence in the warm sector. So that may lend a little bit, maybe somewhat in there, possibly across Louisiana, but it's very subtle. So I am a little bit skeptical over the degree of convection in the warm sector. It's going to be purely fueled by warm advection, and with the forcing much displaced much off to the west, that lends a little bit less confidence in how much those storms will sustain. I've really never seen it work where you're in the southeast, especially where your forcing is so far removed from the overall warm sector, where your warm advection storms are going to happen. But still, the environment looks pretty favorable. Here is our sounding from the open warm sector. Not quite a ton of turning there. Again, low-level shear going to remain somewhat limited. We do have some steeper lapse rates aloft there, approaching 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer, instability above 1,500 joules per kilogram. So this could foster more of a large hail threat with the open warm sector storms, given somewhat weaker low-level shear, strong deep layer shear for supercells, and a little bit better chance of discrete supercells out in the open warm sector for maybe a large hail threat there. But tornado threat does not look all that great, at least Sunday afternoon. We go into Sunday night across Mississippi and Alabama. Let's go ahead and take a couple soundings from there. We'll take soundings out in the open warm sector and see. So this is going to be Monday evening. This is at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time Monday. We do see a little bit of an increase in the open warm sector of our low-level shear. Instability is still very, very good. So this is a pretty robust-looking environment for tornadic supercells there. But again, it's all going to depend on whether or not they can overcome that lack of synoptic scale forcing for ascent and become anything more than just little beans in this type of environment. So we'll just have to wait and see. But overall, the environment would favor an all-hazards threat with those supercells and perhaps a little bit greater tornado threat across central to southern Mississippi into western Alabama come Sunday evening. All right, let's take a look and switch sectors here. Look at our Monday threat again. We won't talk too much about Monday for now, but it does look like we may have a little bit more of a robust low-level response on Monday. And we'll see here what the environment looks like out ahead. On Monday, we'll have a little bit more clarity as we go on here. A little bit limited instability on Monday, not all that surprising. And these profiles would favor an all-hazards threat here, tornado threat especially. A little bit of low-level shear. Again, very straight photographs, low-level response, really not ramping up as much as I thought we might see a little bit more looping low-level photographs. Let's take a look at the low-level jet here. So we do see that it does ramp up. As we go back to Sunday, you'll see not much through the day on Sunday, and then Monday night it starts to ramp up as that low-level cyclone ramps up with the more neutral tilt of the upper trough. And then we see a much stronger low-level response into Monday. A little bit displaced from the overall warm sector, it looks like. Your strongest winds here across eastern Georgia, eastern South Carolina, with your warm sector hanging back a little bit out here, but we could see an favorable overlap of those stronger winds in the low levels and our low-level shear here across maybe eastern Georgia. It's likely we'll have convection ongoing into Monday morning and early afternoon from the previous day, Sunday. And again, we'll have to watch for open warm sector convection. We may have a little bit better chance here for forcing, as that forcing is a little bit closer here, a little bit more tendency for maybe a short wave or two out in the open warm sector, a little bit of a kink in the flow there across Georgia. So that may be a bit better chance on Monday for some prefrontal discrete convection. And that's a pretty good looking profile, assuming we can get adequate instability in here. This is pretty limited thermodynamics with this particular sounding, but the kinematics looking very, very good. Strong veering and strengthening of the low-level winds with height leading to more looped photographs. 250 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity there on Monday across eastern Georgia. So we'll have to watch that for sure. We could see a little bit of a higher severe threat than what we see, a higher tornado threat maybe than what we see on Sunday moving into Monday. So let's take a look at a couple of CAMs here, convection-allowing models. Again, take these with a grain of salt. We can only look out today into tomorrow, but this at least gives us a decent look at what we might be dealing with on the radar come today and tomorrow. So this was the 12Z run of the HRRR. See a lot of those rounds of convection across central and eastern Texas through the day. Again, marginal severe threat with those as we move on into the afternoon and early evening. And then we'll see our main round fire up here across the Edwards Plateau of west central Texas. Those storms, again, will move off to the northeast pretty quickly. You see that northeast motion. They will cross that surface front, probably somewhere in here, and become elevated large hail producers as they cross the boundary. And any storms that are closer to the boundary or just south of the boundary will be in that surface-based regime where we could see more of a damaging wind and brief tornado risk, including as the storms interact with the frontal zone. Those storms will continue into the morning hours on Sunday in a kind of clustered line segment mode there, moving toward the Texas-Louisiana border. They will be along or just north of the surface front, so likely the large hail threat will continue into the morning hours tomorrow, with additional development expected down to the south. Now, how much additional development is still a little bit in question. I will move the sector here to the southeast so we can get a better view for tomorrow. And on the HRRR model, we don't see a ton of additional development down here to the south. You see not a ton, a few little beans here moving in off the Gulf, but not overall widespread convection. And that's a product of the forcing being displaced from this overall region. These are going to be purely warm advection storms. Whether or not these will be surface-based, a little bit in question, especially with northward extent. But we do see some beans here trying to develop across Mississippi and Alabama towards Sunday evening. They ramp up a little bit going into Sunday night, but overall not a ton of discrete, robust-looking supercells here. A few here on the southern end of the line that we may have to watch for. Again, that greater tornado threat may materialize as the low-level winds pick up late Sunday evening across central southern Mississippi into southern Alabama. But overall, the HRRR not picking up on a ton of warm sector supercells here to deal with. And then we go into Monday morning, that threat will continue. Let's take a look at the WRF ARW model here, just another model that we can analyze for convection. So 12Z WRF ARW, you see multiple rounds of storms across Texas through the day today. And then our second round develops this evening across the Edwards Plateau. Some supercell mixed mode supercells and line segments there crossing the front pretty quickly. Those will be mostly elevated storms here across northeast Texas tomorrow morning. And we don't see a ton of additional development here across the southeast states. That's pretty interesting. I'll shift sectors here once again. And notice that there's our initial round Sunday morning you see coming into the screen there. A little bit of a perk up in intensity there, but those storms will certainly be elevated, it looks like. Let's pull up. So this is hour 35. Let's go to the dew points here. We'll go back to hour 35. And yeah, it looks like those storms will be on the north side of the front. The front looks to be right in here, our warm front. And I'll go back to our storms here, our reflectivity. Go to hour 35, and we'll see where those storms are with respect to the front. You can see those storms here, that robust updraft helicity streak is well north of the front. So that would be mostly a hail producer in that environment. And you can see south of the front, not much going on at all. This is at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time on Sunday evening. Not much going on in the open warm sector there. And again, I think that's a product of a lack of overall synoptic scale forcing for ascent. Now, we do have some storms along the frontal zone, which may have a chance to produce some severe weather, given the stronger low-level shear along that front. So we'll have to watch that for sure. But not much in the open warm sector, and that's, if you're thinking of chasing, that may be a little bit problematic, and I think one of the main drawbacks of this setup is the overall lack of forcing for warm sector convection in this environment, other than just broad warm advection in the low levels. So that is something to note for sure, that these models not picking up on a lot of convection in the open warm sector Sunday. Mostly confined to these surface boundaries where surface convergence and forcing is a little bit stronger. And a lot of those storms are north of the boundary out across the southeast, which would maintain more of a hail threat rather than a tornado threat. So here we go. NSSL WRF model, just another model we look at. There's our round this evening. Crosses the front pretty quickly. Activity moves into northeast Texas by morning. And this model in particular is a little bit more robust with convective development along the cold front back to the west, the frontal zone moisture gradient back to the west, farther to the south. So that is a promising sign for storms there in this particular model. We do see some updraft helicity streaks in there, perhaps some more robust supercells. Now let's take a look here. I just want to see where these are located with respect to the boundary once again. So this is hour 36. We'll take a look at those storms, which are located right in there. And we'll go to our dew point to show where our front is. And those are, yeah, again, along or just north of the front. Front is right in there on this particular model. The storms are kind of right in here. So that makes me think the storms will have a tendency to be elevated, will be forced by the frontal zone, and may tend to cross the frontal zone with that southwesterly flow aloft and may become elevated pretty quickly. So, even though it looks like this particular model, this NSSL WRF model is a little bit more robust with convection down there, it doesn't look like it as much as that. Those storms look to be along or just north of the front. Continuing into the evening hours, not much in the open warm sector once again. Maybe some attempts here to be a little bit more surface-based convection south of the frontal zone, but not a ton here in the open warm sector. Again, a product of the lack of overall forcing in the warm sector. So that's going to wrap things up for this video. Again, we have a multi-day severe weather threat that will really start to focus this evening into the overnight hours tomorrow morning, and then through the day Sunday and Monday. Again, for today, again, mostly tonight, slight risk, level 2 out of 5 in the yellow shaded area there from the Edwards Plateau of West Texas toward the Austin, San Antonio, Waco corridor there along I-35. Under the gun for the greatest threat for severe storms tonight. Biggest threat with tonight's storms, again, going to be large hail, given the tendency for these storms to cross the frontal boundary pretty quickly. As they become elevated, they will become probably prolific hail producers, perhaps some 2+ inch stones there, maybe even greater baseball size plus with these storms as they cross the front, especially tonight. And again, any storms that can maintain themselves south of the surface front or interact with the surface front will have that brief tornado threat. 2% extends along the frontal zone out to the east as well, across East Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Damaging winds a threat as well, but on the low end, just like the tornado threat. Then we move into day 2, tomorrow, Sunday. Slight risk again, level 2 out of 5 here from East Texas into Louisiana, Mississippi, and western Alabama. Again, I'm not sure, and I don't think at this point, looking at the data, we'll see a risk upgrade given the uncertainties about overall warm sector convection, given the lack of forcing over the warm sector. We saw some of that mid-level ridging over the warm sector, which may tend to suppress convection a little more sinking motion, whereas we want to see rising motion for severe storms. Storms may be confined more to the boundaries. The cold front back to the west, cold front or dry line back to the west, warm frontal zone draped across central and central Louisiana, south central Mississippi, where surface convergence is a little bit better. And given the northeasterly motion of these storms, they may tend to cross the front a little bit, especially as the surface low moves off to the east. So not really seeing a super significant severe threat with Sunday's event. The wind profiles do start to increase as we go into Sunday evening, early Monday morning out here, especially across Mississippi and Alabama. So any supercells that can sustain themselves and become robust in the warm sector will have that all hazards threat, given fairly robust instability, steep lapse rates aloft, and fairly straight photographs, at least initially, may favor a large hail threat, and then we start to see those wind profiles increase toward the eastern portion of the risk area Sunday evening, where we may see the tornado threat ramp up. Then we go into day 3, Monday, where we have that slight risk across Alabama, Georgia, Florida, into South Carolina. If we can see robust instability develop across this area, which the NAM model in particular was a little bit hesitant on, the wind profiles may be a little bit better because we have that upper level trough taking on more of a neutral tilt rather than positive tilt, so a more robust low level response is taking place, farther northward advance of the warm sector, and perhaps a stronger kinematics, stronger wind profile in the low level. So we'll have to watch that for sure. Definitely a little bit of little unclear at this point what is going to happen. We'll have to wait and see what happens tonight into tomorrow to make judgments on Monday. But we'll have to watch that for sure. Would not be surprised to see if models continue on this trend to maybe see an uptick in the severe weather potential here across this area. Again, that includes places like southeast Alabama, Dothan toward Georgia, Columbus, Atlanta, Savannah, over toward northern Florida, Tallahassee toward Jacksonville. So very interesting setup moving into Monday. A little bit unclear at this point again, but the main severe threat for now is going to be tonight through tomorrow, and then we'll worry about Monday as we get a few more details in over the next couple of days. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.